Well, hi, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Mark Raven. Our guest today is Art Byrne. He's a returning guest. He was here with us back in episode 158. That was 12 years ago, if you can believe it. Art and I can barely believe it. Back then, we discussed his book that was new at the time, The Lean Turnaround. And today, we're discussing his latest book, The Lean Turnaround Answer Book. It's an edited compilation of his Ask Art columns that were published on the Lean Enterprise Institute website. Art has been implementing lean strategy in various US-based manufacturing and service companies, such as Danaher Corporation. He's been doing this for more than 30 years. He was at the Wiremold Company that he ran for 11 years, and he's retired as an operating partner at the private equity firm J.W. Childs Associates LP, but Art's still busy with the book and other things. So welcome back to the podcast. How are you, Art?
Fine, thank you, Mark. Nice to be with you.
Yeah, it's good to have you back. Tell us a little bit, if you would, about things that you're still actively involved with and trying to help people with lean.
Yeah, well, my objective really in writing a book the first time was really to just pass on the knowledge that I had gained over all the years, because as those of us that have been very involved in lean, we all learned it from somebody else. And
Hmm.
and so the fact that they helped us, you always feel like obligated to pass on that knowledge. So I wrote the first book, The Lean Turnaround, and that went over pretty well. We sold a
Hmm.
lot of books and got a lot of questions. And the main question I got from that book was, well, gee, Art, this is great, but how do you really do this stuff?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of theory, and you say, well, here's the theory of lean and whatever, but I mean, how do you actually do it? So that prompted the second book, which is called The Lean Turnaround Action Guide.
Hmm.
The Lean Turnaround Action Guide is really like a case study. It's a lean implementation. We took a company, traditionally run company with 5 years of financial forecasts and history, and then we step by step converted it to lean. And then in the end, we showed what the financial history looked like 5 years later under lean, which was obviously quite different. But it was I thought a good example if you wanted to see how would you go about this. This was really just the way that I've gone about it pretty much everywhere.
Hmm.
And so it's a very good case study. And that in turn generated other questions, of course.
Yeah.
And fortunately, LEI, the Lean Enterprise Institute, gave me some space on their weekly lean post
Hmm.
uh, to answer those questions. And I've been doing that for about 8 years or so. And I had over 100 I had 100 articles
Hmm.
on the lean post, and seemed to have a pretty good readership. And we did a few webinars and got big attendance and that kind of thing. And so when they asked me to stop, I said, well, gee, I don't want all this knowledge to go away.
Hmm.
We've got a lot of articles here. And so we selected 70 of the articles and we organized them into a book,
Hmm.
which we now call the Lean Turnaround Answer Book, which is actually being published today for the first time. It's been in Kindle form
Yeah.
for a week and a half, but today was the publishing date.
Well,
So this is
congrats.
a good day for us to talk.
Yeah.
Uh, and it really, I think, answers just about every normal question about lean that you could imagine. It's in article form, but it gives you answers to a lot of things. We've organized it into sort of five sections. The one is the lean fundamentals, because you need to understand what those are to have any chance at doing this.
Hmm.
Because it's lean to me is sort of it's not just it's not some manufacturing thing or whatever. It's more of a philosophy and a
Hmm.
strategy of how to run your business. But you need to understand what those fundamentals are before you can even attempt this. And then we have a second section on lean management, which we get a lot of questions on, on that kind of thing. And then how do you implement it is another section. And then what's the organizational structure that you need? Because if you think of it really, um, organizational structure creates a lot of the issues and problems that
Hmm.
companies have. If you're organized in a functional way, the waste that creates is enormous, but nobody can see it because that's the traditional way to organize a company. It's the traditional way to do it. In manufacturing companies, for example, we take, the way that we fundamentally organize it is by type of equipment. So all the punch presses are in one department and all the drilling machines are in another department, et cetera.
Right.
It seems like somebody decided that machines are happier if they're right next to other machines just like them. But of
Yeah.
course, for making the product, that makes no sense whatsoever.
Right. For
Uh,
flow. Right. Yeah.
And so we have a whole section on that structure. What's the structural changes needed to implement lean? And then there's kind of a catch-all section on some other thoughts and things that didn't fit into the other sections. So things like lean accounting, which people overlook.
Hmm.
But if you don't switch to lean accounting fairly early on in your lean journey, and you try and go with the traditional standard cost accounting, this traditional standard cost accounting fights everything that you're trying to do in lean. You're trying to get rid of inventory. Standard cost accounting loves inventory.
Yeah.
And so there's some other things in that section that are kind of fun or interesting, like, can you use poetry for lean? And that people will say, what are you,
Did you
crazy?
say poetry?
Poetry,
I
yeah.
want to make sure I heard you. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's just a fun story about one of the companies that we acquired when I was running Wiremold. And, we bought this company and we were doing the first Kaizen events. And during the event, I went out in the factory and we had this huge area of work in process inventory. I mean, these were racks 30 feet high in the air and, 50, 60 feet long, millions of dollars sitting in there and work in process inventory. So I went out and I hung up a sign on every rack and I said, Parts Hotel closing. This rack comes down by, and I put a date.
Hmm.
And then I went to the next rack, and a month later, I put another sign, Parts Hotel closing, blah, blah, blah. So as I'm walking back, a lady pokes her head out of this little office and she said, Hey, you, what are you doing? My people are all upset.
Yeah.
And I said, Oh, are you in charge of this area? And she
Mhm.
said, Oh, yes, I am. She had on this sort of funny hat, and I guess she was pretty well known in the plant
Yeah.
because she always wore these different hats and whatever. She was very outspoken about everything.
Hmm.
Said, "Oh, well, great. Come with me, and I'll show you what I want you to do." And I took her back, and I showed her the signs, and I said, "Look, every time I want you to take these racks down and get rid of this inventory because it's all waste. And
Hmm.
every time a rack comes down, I want you to send me my sign so that I know it came down."
Yeah.
So she looked at me and she said, Well, okay. And so a month later, I was at the plant doing another Kaizen, and she came up to me and she hands me my sign. So there's the sign. And then she hands me a poem. And her name was Barbara,
Hmm.
and she called herself Dame Barbie in her Merry Men. And King Arthur had ordered this inventory to go. Hey, and so it was a kind of fun poem. And I said, Well,
Hmm.
Barbara, thank you. That's great. That's really great. And she looked at me and she said, Well, we're not done. I said, What do you mean? And she said, Well, I gave you a poem. You got to give me a poem. So I said, Okay. And I went in the cafeteria before the wrap up meeting on Friday and I wrote a poem about the Parts Hotel.
Hmm.
So at the meeting, I read her poem and I read my poem. Well, this went on every month for about 8, 9 months. But in the end, we freed up something like $2.5 million worth of inventory and 20 or 30,000 square feet of space
Hmm.
that we could use for other things. So
Yeah.
it was just an article or a story about, you got to have fun with this.
Yeah.
You got to kind of
But
enjoy yourself as you go along. And
yeah, I'm trying to picture, this was a like a heartfelt poem, like an ode to inventory. It wasn't some sort of like limerick thrown in your direction with some
no, no,
anger
no, no,
or uh,
no. She kind of got it, and And
Yeah.
then I wrote the Parts Hotel, which talked about all the inventory sleeping there, and
Hmm.
we put our parts in, we take great care of our parts. We let them sleep for a long time. Sometimes they rust and all this kind of thing.
It's more like the parts have an apartment lease. They're there
Yeah,
for
yeah.
months, not days. Right.
But in a way, it got the point across to
Mhm.
everybody in the business that, hey,
Yeah.
this is really wasteful. We need this money for new equipment. We need this money to invest in new products. And instead, it's just sitting here in a big pile of inventory, sleeping.
Yeah.
You know, you can say, well, that sounds a little nutty, but it was very effective in this particular case.
And at the same time as you were setting this target for closing the hotel, I'm sure they realized their goal was not to find a different place to store the parts.
No, no, no.
This is where I'm sure machines were being moved into cells and other changes that would actually improve flow, right?
Absolutely. All that stuff was going on at the same time. And I asked at one point somebody, I said, well, how did Barbara reduce all this inventory? What, and they said, oh, everybody's afraid of Barbara. And so whenever we took inventory out, she just said it can't come back. And so they didn't want to cross her. And so that's how it came down. But we made a ton of money doing that.
Yeah. And for those who, I want to ask one follow-up question about the cost accounting and inventory. And you can check my understanding if I don't have this right. But is it fair to say one of the problems is, running the machine, cranking out more parts, even if they're going in the inventory, from an accounting standpoint now, the cost per piece seems lower? Is that kind of one of the dysfunctions?
Well, yes and no. It's
Uh-huh.
basically, let's just say that we have, um, under absorption accounting,
Hmm.
you're absorbing the overhead costs based upon either man hours or machine hours.
Hmm.
So let's say machine hours is pretty common.
Yeah.
So let's say that we have 10 machines needed to make part A, and we come in today and one of the machines is not working. So that means we can't make any part A's today, nothing,
Hmm.
nothing we can sell. But the accounting department says, oh, run all the other machines full
Mm.
blast, making
Yeah.
parts. So now I'm making 9 other parts. I can't sell anything. And so all I'm doing is stacking up inventory. But I'm also getting absorption hours off of these machines and running these parts.
Mm.
So the absorption hours are taking the overhead and moving it up into inventory so it doesn't hit this month's P&L.
Mm.
So from an accounting point of view, the accountants say, hey, we had a really good day. From an operation point of view, I said, wait a minute, I didn't make anything that I can sell.
Yeah.
But accounting says, oh no, that was good. You did a good job. And so, what happens is that people understand this fairly quickly. And the guys running these functional departments, they understand that as they get near the end of the month, if they haven't made they're looking at absorption hours. They're not looking at
Yeah.
the customer. They're just looking at absorption hours, and they know what parts in their department have the most absorption hours. And so when they get near the end of the month and they're short of absorption hours, they don't want to get yelled at. So they start making parts that have the most absorption hours.
Yeah.
We don't happen to have any demand for those parts, by the way, but
Right.
make absorption hours. And so the month will look pretty good and everybody will be very happy. So on the one hand, with lean, we're trying to get rid of the inventory because it's hiding the waste.
Hmm.
And over here in the finance department, we're mad at you if you start dropping inventory.
Hmm.
Because when you drop inventory, the overhead that was thrown up in there before starts to come out. And today's overhead has no place to be absorbed. And so you're getting a double shot of overhead. And so the finance department, while lean is being implemented and good things are happening, the finance department's screaming its head off. You got to stop this. This is crazy. Our earnings look terrible. Our cash flow looks pretty good, but our earnings don't look too good.
Mm.
So they're all upset, even though you're doing the right thing. So
Yeah.
if you don't change the accounting fairly early on, you're just going to have a battle with the finance department for a long time.
Hmm.
We we had that experience. We had a lot of companies come visit us at Wiremold in particular, and they'd go home, and a number of them would start their own lean conversion, and they were making good progress. And then about a year later, they'd call us and they'd say, "Can we send our CFO and a few of his people to see you
Yeah.
for a week?" because they're all upset and they just don't understand.
Mm,
So we had to, so we would say, okay, yeah, send them over and we'll see if we can straighten them out. But otherwise, if what they're looking at from their absorption point of view and what's really going on are completely different. And
mhm,
besides, in my opinion, absorption accounting is something that it can't be understood by humans. And, it tries to create standard costs for every product out to 4 decimal points.
mhm.
And if you ask people in the business, how many believe that the standard costs are actually correct? No hands will go up. I've tried this many, many, many times in different presentations I gave. Nobody believes the standard cost, but the finance department believes them. And people set their prices based upon standard costs
Right.
that aren't correct,
Mhm.
which means either you're going to leave money on the table or you're going to overprice the thing and you're going to lose market share
Yeah.
just because your standard costs were wrong.
And Ori Fume was your CFO at Wiremold, is that right?
That's correct. Yeah,
Yeah. So you and Ori were on kind of the leading edge of not just identifying these dysfunctions, but figuring out how to better align accounting and finance with lean and operations, right?
that's right. Ori was a unique finance guy and that he's a very good strategic thinker as well. And he wrote one of the better books on lean accounting called Real Numbers with
Mhm.
a lady named Jean Cunningham.
Yeah.
Used to be the CFO at a company called Landtech. And I think that was very helpful to a lot of companies. And it's funny, I'll tell you a story about Ori. When I first got to Wiremold and we started doing Kaizen, very first Kaizen, I had all of my senior executives on one team or another. I think we had 4 teams, had Shin Jiu-Jitsu there. And I said, Ori, I want you to be on the setup reduction team. Well, he's the finance guy and he said, but Art, I'm the finance guy. I don't know anything about setup reduction.
Right.
Ori, I want you to go on the team. But all right, we're going to close the books this week. No, no, no. And the auditors are coming in to start the annual. No, 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 no. You gotta go. You gotta get on the team.
Right.
So he finally goes out, and he goes on this team, and it was a setup reduction team. And they went from 90-minute setup time to 5 minutes over the
Wow.
course of
Mhm.
one week. That was pretty normal for us, by the way, at
Yeah.
Wiremold. Our average setup reduction result after a 1 week setup reduction Kaizen was a 90% reduction
Yeah.
at Wiremold, any kind of equipment. Anyway, Ori, of course, is still the finance guy, and he decides to keep track. He says, if you're going to reduce setup time, it's got to be capital intensive. We're going to spend a lot of money. So he kept track the whole week. How
Mhm.
much money did we spend to go from 90 minutes to 5 minutes? I
Mhm.
think it was $100.
Yeah.
And so because he was such a good strategic thinker, it dawned on him right away that, boy, if we can do this and it doesn't cost us money, think of the strategic impact on the business
Yeah.
that setup reduction is going to have, right? And so he became, my best disciple, if you will.
Mhm.
I mean, he really helped everybody else get on board. He just understood it. And
Yeah.
yet I've seen over and over, I've seen people see something like that and just say, well, that was interesting, but I don't know what it means. And we're not going to do it again or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But think about, while we're on the subject of setup reduction, just think about how strategic, how strategic that is. And no one would ever think about that. So
Mhm.
let's just take an example that we have 2 companies, A and B. They buy the same exact equipment from the same vendor, and then they compete against each other. The only difference is company A, who's the market share leader, takes 1 hour to change over his equipment. And company B, who's sort of coming from behind, they figure out for hardly any money how to change the machine in 1 minute.
Mhm.
And then you just have to ask yourself, well, okay, um, if that's the case, who has the lowest cost, A or B? Well, obviously, the guy who can change it in 1 minute is going to have much, much lower cost. First of all, he can run the machines for 59 minutes more than the other
Yeah.
guy can. Uh, and then you say, well, all right, but who has, and let's say they can only each afford 1 hour of changeover time a day based upon their demand, et cetera. So then you ask the question, well, who has the best customer service? Well, obviously B has much better customer service because A can only make two different products a day.
Hmm.
The product before the changeover and the product after the changeover. Whereas B, he can make 61 products a day, right? The one before the changeover plus
Hmm.
60 changeovers. So all we did was reduce setup time. Didn't cost us a lot of money,
Right.
reduce setup time. Now I've got the lowest cost and the best customer service. To me, that's pretty strategic. It's not some fundamental manufacturing thing. It's not a cost reduction program, et
Right.
cetera. And so but you would never call in the security analysts and say, "Hey, guys, we want to talk to you today about a strategic thing called setup reduction."
Yeah.
They think you were nuts. I mean, they just think you're completely crazy because people don't understand. They don't understand the value of lean. They don't understand what it does for you. They don't understand what it does for you from allowing you to be a time-based competitor, et cetera, all
Yeah.
of which comes from simple things like setup reduction.
So I want to come back and ask you a little bit more about the book Art, but I'm curious to explore a little bit about your transition from being a CEO to working as a partner in private equity. How did your role change, or how was lean utilized in private equity? Were you trying to convince CEOs to care about things like setup reduction, or what? I'm just curious how your work impacted things.
In a way, it didn't change at all for me, but you're correct. I mean, Wiremold, we bought 21 different companies, so I always had to change. Always had to convince the new
Mhm.
CEOs why to do lean and what we were going to do, that kind of thing. So moving into private equity, at the time, JW Childs had I think we had about 17 or 18 different companies in the portfolio, and I became chairman of four of them. Now, as chairman, my basic role was to implement lean in the companies I was responsible for. Um, I wound up having to fire about three or four of these CEOs because
Mhm.
I couldn't get them to come along with it, really.
Yeah.
You can't wait. The private equity business, we're trying to triple our investment in about 5 years.
Mhm.
That doesn't always happen, of course, but you have to have some target.
Yeah.
And so I can't wait for these guys to come along and get on board with lean. Uh, and then with the rest of the companies, my role was kind of to try and help them understand lean and to get them started. So I spent some time, not a lot of time, but I did some Kaizen events with some of the other companies and that kind of thing. And so the role was really kind of the same, showing people doing Kaizen, getting companies to do this stuff. And, like we had a company that made suits. Joseph Abood was the name of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I went there, they were in Fall River, Massachusetts, and one of the only plants left in the United States that actually made clothing. Um, and I went and they said, well, I said, how long does it take you to make a suit? Well, they said 6 weeks. No, 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 no,
Yeah.
no. We want the 1 day suit, you
Right.
know. So trying to teach them how to do the 1 day suit, that took some time and whatever, but we got things like that to happen and in very different kinds of companies. And so, it had a big impact, and not always from me being there all the time, but I was sort of the initiator, if you will.
Yeah.
Now I spent in the companies I was chairman of, I did spend a lot of time. I attended a lot of Kaizens and really pushed really hard to get these guys to do what they should do. Um, we had one company that was in that actually the first company I was chairman of was a company called the Celte. They were in the filing business, and this is hard filing, lever arch files and hanging file folders. We
Hmm.
know in the U.S. as Pendaflex
Hmm.
or just manila file folders, those kind of things. Of course, that was an industry that was declining at about 4% per year because, laptops and iPhones, people were storing their stuff on their laptops or on their iPad, and they weren't using hard filing as much anymore. And even there, where that business declined 4% a year for all the time we owned it, because of lean, we were still able to get 3.5 times our money back when we sold that business.
Yeah.
because we were able to do things. We were able to stay ahead of the curve. We were able to consolidate. We were able to close factories. I think we freed up something like this was about a $1.1 billion business when we bought it, but it wasn't making too much money.
Hmm.
And in the end, we were making, we were down to just the European portion of it. Um, but we were making money, and we were doing quite well in a business that was declining just because of lean. I think we freed up over $200 million worth of inventory, 2 million square feet of floor space,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all through different Kaizens and things that we did.
Hmm.
And in that particular case, the biggest factory in Europe was in Poland. And every year we had what we call the President's Kaizen. And we had John Childs, who was the head of JW Childs. We had myself as the chairman of the SLT. We had the worldwide leader of SLT, who was based in the United States, and we had the European president of SLT, all present for a whole week doing Kaizen on the shop floor in a factory in Poland. So this sent a tremendous message, of course, through the business that, hey, we're serious about this. We're going to
Hmm.
spend our time on the shop floor. You better pay attention and get on board with this. And they did a really tremendous job, I thought.
Yeah. And I know there are some private equity firms that seem to have a lean-based approach for how they want to help create value with the company. I imagine there's a certain profile or formula. I'm not asking for exactly what the formula is, but looking for companies that might be undervalued by kind of a more traditional financial view where a lean thinker would see potential in transforming operations, transforming the management system.
Uh-huh. Well, I think that I don't know for sure, but I think a lot of I mean, most of the private equity companies are basically a bunch of finance guys,
Mhm.
and they've traditionally been that way. And I think they're still mostly that way, but they've learned to go find somebody who knows lean and hire them when
Mhm.
they need them in certain companies, that kind
Mhm.
of thing.
Yeah.
I think that's more the model that you're going to find if you looked at that. Um, but yeah, the I would get involved, for example, when we were looking at a new company, I would be part of the due diligence.
Mhm.
And part of that was just to go look and see and walk around the factories. And I could give you a pretty good idea right off the bat what was possible here, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
For example, if you look, I look at a company, traditional company that turns its inventory 3 times. To me, that's a gold mine.
Mhm.
Right. Just that fact alone is a gold mine because it tells you a lot of things. My experience, a company that turns its inventory 3 times for the most part has 25 to 40% too many people,
Mhm.
has 5 to 6 times too much inventory, has 50% too much space, which is, of course, where they store all the inventory,
Right.
has long lead times, and has periodic quality problems because of the batching that's done and the inability to when a quality problem pops up, it's hard for them to solve it
Mhm.
because it happened 6 weeks ago.
Right.
How do you solve that? And so you just look at a company that's turning inventory 3 times, and you should be able to make a lot of money by turning that company around.
Mhm.
It's going to be a lot of cash flow. At Wiremold, we found that we could, when we bought a company, we could pretty much always get our cash back in about 3 years
Mhm.
because almost all of these companies were turning inventory about 3 times. So we could get a lot of it back from inventory. We could get some of it back from improving the margins
Mhm.
and then some of it back from growing the company. So we knew going in that if they were turning it 3 times, we could get that to 6 times at the end of the first year.
Mhm.
We could get it to 8 times at the end of the second year, et cetera, et cetera, et
Mhm.
cetera. And so, it was just something that it gave you a lot of confidence when you bought something.
Mhm.
It gave you a strategic advantage on how much you could bid for the company if you had to bid against other people, because you had this cushion, you had this enormous cash cushion of all this wasteful inventory that you could just pick up and use.
Yeah. So with all of that potential and with those benefits when a company goes through a lean transformation, is it fair to say that lean is still not quite the default management system, even in American manufacturing companies?
I would say
By
by
far,
far,
it's not. Yeah.
by far it's not. And if you asked me 10 years ago, I would have said that only maybe 15%, 20% of the companies even have thought about lean or tried it. Today, I think that number would be much higher. It might be
Mhm.
50%, whatever. But if you ask how many of those companies are successful at becoming a lean enterprise, I think the number drops down to about 5 to 7%.
Mhm.
Not very many become successful. And the reason for that is almost every company that thinks about lean from a traditional point of view, they just look at it as a cost reduction program.
Mhm.
And their basic approach to it is this is going to be what we do for cost reduction. They don't change anything else. The sales force is out still selling big batch orders and giving volume discounts and all that kind of stuff. Everything else is in the batch. Um, they just want to reduce costs. And if that's your approach to lean, you're not going to be very successful because with lean, everything has to change.
Mhm.
You don't change everything, you're not going to be very successful. And I'll give you an interesting example. When I first went to Wiremold, one of my first questions was, what percentage of our shipments go in the last week of the month? Pretty normal question. And for a batch manufacturing company, it applies to everybody.
Mhm.
And the answer in Wiremold's case was 50%. I said, 50%? We're gonna try and level load the production in the factory.
Right.
How can I ship 50% in the last week of the month?
Mhm.
And that's true in almost all batch manufacturing companies. You're gonna find something similar to that. It might not be quite 50%, but it's gonna be 35, 40% in the last week of the month
Yeah.
because everything is being batched. And that means, think about that. If I ship 50% in the last week of the month, I have to be staffed to do that. I have to be staffed, but I'm overstaffed the other 3 weeks, right?
Right.
I'm massively overstaffed the rest of the time in order to deal with this 50%.
Yeah.
So my next question, of course, was, well, why? Why are we shipping 50% in the last week of the month? Doesn't make any sense at all. Um, when we looked into that, we found that it was our sales terms. Our sales terms were
Mhm.
forcing when we sold mostly to distributors, forcing our distributors, electrical distributors, to order in the last week of the month
Yeah.
because they got an extra 2% cash discount if
Mhm.
they paid by the 10th day of the month following. So if they order the last week of the month, they're going to get 45-day sales terms.
Yeah.
And the electrical distribution business in the United States, like most distribution businesses, they're fairly low margin, 3 to 5%. So the 2% cash discount, that was a big deal.
Mhm.
They all wanted to grab it, so everybody ordered that way. So, I just said, well, that we can't do that. I can't deliver value to these customers with these sales terms.
Mhm.
So what we did is we changed. We actually had a 5% cash discount. The industry was at 2. And I said, all right, we're going to go out to everybody and we're going to give them a choice. You can keep the 5%, but you got to pay us twice a month.
Mhm.
You got to order and pay us twice a month. And we'd like you to, or you can go to the industry terms at 2% and do it the same way. But right now you're getting 5% from us. You're going to get 2 if you stay where you are.
Mhm.
Of course, everybody changed. Everybody
Right.
changed. They wanted the 5%. So now our incoming order rate was pretty flat, right? I mean,
Mhm.
it changed it a lot, but it wasn't enough because they still ordered off their MRP system. So when they'd order 3 or 4 months worth all the time. So everything was like the orders came in like this, very
Mhm.
lumpy.
Yeah.
And so then we went back out to the distributors and we said, look, we deliver to you once a week. And in some cases, a couple of times a week, if they were a big customer, we had set up a sales route, a delivery system where if I would tell you, Mark, look, your truck is going to come on Thursday, every Thursday between noon and 2 o'clock. And we were very good at doing that. So then we could go back to to the distributors and say, hey, you carry 4 months worth of our inventory, and yet we deliver to you every Thursday between
Mhm.
12 and 2. Why do you want to carry? That's a big waste for you. Why do you
Right.
want to do that?
Yeah.
And so we were able to convince a lot of the distributors to just tell us what you sold every day, and we'll have it on next Thursday's truck.
Yeah.
And your
Mhm.
inventory, we would drop your inventory from 4 months down to, maybe we'll get it down to 3 weeks,
Yeah.
or maybe a little less. And then we want you to, take some of that money that we just gave you and add back extra SKUs of ours that you weren't carrying before.
Mhm. Yeah.
And the people who did that, the distributors who did that, their sales went up of our products went up by about 10%, and
Wow.
their profit on our products went up by 20%,
Yeah.
because they became known as the guy in their area who always had the odd Wiremold products in
Mhm.
stock.
Mhm.
Even though they didn't have very many,
Yeah.
they always had the one you wanted. And so, it was a sort of two-step process, but that leveled out our demand and leveled out our production. And guess what? Nobody else in the electrical industry did it,
Yeah.
because
Well,
they were batch guys. They liked to do it
yeah.
in big batches.
Well, and I'm sure it didn't take long to prove to the distributor with a lean production system that you could reliably make those deliveries. They didn't have to have
That's
the
right.
just in case buffer inventory.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were pretty skeptical, so it took them quite a
Yeah.
while. But,
Yeah.
but yeah,
Well,
eventually.
when you talk about the sales incentives and lumpy sales, and give a quick example of how prevalent this would be. 25 years ago this summer, I joined Dell Computer, which had amazing flow through the
Yeah.
factory. It was not a batch operation. It was
Yeah.
very much single piece flow. Software installation would be the slowest step in the process. A PC could flow through in a couple of hours. They had great flow, but they had also conditioned their customers to wait for the end of quarter discount.
Yeah.
The natural demand for computers was probably very level, and they had this enormous hockey stick effect that was really detrimental. And that's why, I don't like to label them a lean company, even back then when they made their computers.
Yeah. Well, I remember years ago, I introduced Boeing to Shinjitsu back in the early 1990s, and they became a very big client of Shinjitsu. And I remember going out there, and I gave a speech at Boeing one time. And at the time, and this was like, they had like about 800 of their management people in the room. And I said, look, the airplane business in terms of seat miles and the number of passengers, it's been a very
Mhm.
steady, it's a very steady business. It grows at like 2 or 3%
Mhm.
a year. It has been for a long, long time. But your business is very cyclical.
Yeah.
Your business is up and down and up and down. And the reason for that is your lead time is 14 months to make an airplane.
Hmm.
It's 14 months. I said, you've got to change that. You've got to get it done. I think my target for them was 6 weeks. You
Hmm.
got to get it to 6 weeks. And of course, I'm sure they all looked at me like, who's this idiot? And then Shin Jiu-Jitsu showed them how to make a 737 in less than a week, I think. They got a moving line going and those kind of things happening at the time. So, once you do that, it changes what's going on in your business. It changes the way the customers look at you. It changes everything.
Yeah.
Um, but people, like you say, like the Dell example is a good example where, and think about the automotive companies for years. They would just build inventory, and then they'd have these big sales
Yeah.
discounts. And so the customers and the distributors, the dealers, they learn, don't
Hmm.
buy anything until they offer the big discount.
Yeah.
And then it would just repeat. The cycle would repeat.
Yeah. And it was not only the customer incentives, but I remember it was the salesperson incentives
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
were higher at the end of quarter two. But back to Boeing though, I mean, it kind of begs the question with events of recent years and with executive changes, did they, I'll say it, this might not be the nice way to say it, but did they forget everything Shingijutsu taught them?
Oh,
We might just be speculating, but yeah.
well, yeah, it's a little speculation, I guess, but yeah, I would say maybe not all of it, but a lot of it. And I can say because last couple of years, I made a couple of visits to Spirit
Hmm.
Airplane. And Spirit, of course, used to be part of Boeing and had gone through the Shinjujutsu training when they were part of Boeing. And when I got there, that had all disappeared, completely disappeared. And, I was able to actually get them back doing some lean stuff to start to try and do that
Yeah.
because they had gone off into just a traditional approach to things. And and then, of course, Boeing, I don't know, but I mean, from what I've read and whatever, if you think about it, one thing that Toyota taught us years ago was the automotive company's main mantra was never stop the line.
Hmm.
Toyota came along and said, the way to quality and the way to low cost is stop the line,
Right.
right? And so Boeing had been taught stop the line
Hmm.
by Shinjitsu. And of course, a lot of their problems recently seem to be they were pushing don't stop the line again. And they were having these what they call travelers, where,
Right.
it was supposed to be installed in station B, didn't get installed until some place way afterwards. And of course, they didn't have the tools and the expertise of how to do it.
Hmm.
And so they wound up with a lot of these problems. So, I can't really just say fundamentally that Boeing stopped doing that, but they did a bunch of other stupid things, I thought, in terms of, they moved the headquarters from
Hmm.
Seattle near the factory to Chicago, then they moved it to Washington, D.C.
Hmm.
That's a nutty place to run anything out of.
Yeah.
Uh, and then of course they outsourced the Dreamliner. They basically outsourced the Dreamliner, and they had all kinds of delays because their outsourced partners couldn't do what they said they were going to do.
Right.
So even bringing that plane online, they had all kinds of problems because of the outsourcing, which is something they had never done before.
Right.
So you can point a lot of fingers at executive decisions they made, but
Yeah.
I think a lot of those go back to the concept of what I call make the month.
Hmm.
Most companies, traditional companies, run on make the month.
Right.
And when I have one of the articles in the new book is, what happens when make the month meets lean? Are they compatible? And of course, they're not. They're
Yeah.
not compatible at all. But if you're going to run things on make the month, think about what you're doing. It takes 3 weeks for most of these companies to close the books at the end of the month. Then they're going to have a big review of what happened last month. So they're always looking backwards. They're
Hmm.
not looking forward. They're looking backwards at something that already happened. And of course, you can't do anything about something that already happened. Trying to run the company forward looking at something that already happened.
Hmm.
It doesn't make any sense, but it makes sense to them, I
Hmm.
guess.
Yeah.
And I know at GE, my first introduction to lean was my first general manager job at General Electric. And we just created a small Kanban system between myself and another factory that was also, this was in the lighting business group. And this other factory was my supplier.
Hmm.
And what we did is we bought a truck. They were about 45 minutes from my plant. And they were supplying these little arc tubes that went into the high intensity lamps that we made. And so we bought a truck and we created Kanban cards for these little arc tubes. They were pretty expensive little parts. And we just said, look, the truck will come every morning. We'll give you the Kanban cards that we used yesterday, and you bring them back tomorrow. That's all we did.
Right.
And my inventory dropped from 40 days to 3. And their inventory went from probably 60 days. They had a huge room full of these arc tubes to 0.
Hmm.
They were making these in the furnaces, so you couldn't shut down the furnace. So they just made the ones that came back on the Kanban cards every day and brought them back the next day. So we dropped inventory dramatically, but no one in GE cared because it was all nothing but make the month. No one
Hmm.
cared about inventory or cash flow. It's just make the month.
Hmm.
And so we didn't get any pats on the back for that. But what we saw was, gee, as we dropped the inventory, look at what else happened. Our customer service got better.
Hmm.
Our costs went down. Our quality got better. Our employees were happier. The shop floor was neater and cleaner and therefore safer. We had all this whole list of things that occurred just because we were able to reduce the inventory and still give really great customer service, right? So I just said, look, wherever I go from now on, I'm going to try and learn more about this lean stuff
Mhm.
and use that to run any company because
Yeah.
it's just a no-brainer when you think about what happens. And yet, the make the month companies, they don't learn that. They can't learn it. It's just
Mm.
too difficult. And if you go back and and say what happened to GE, well, a lot of things happened to GE. They got into the credit corporation and a bunch
Mhm.
of other things, and then things changed, and we had the financial crisis, and so a
Right.
lot of things them hit them at the same time. 9/11 really knocked out
Right.
their aircraft engine business for a while. So a lot of pressure. There's lots of things that happened to GE, but to me, fundamentally, the drive for make the month was something that was a real negative thing for GE
Mhm.
overall.
Yeah.
Because when you push people that hard for that one thing, they're going to make a lot of decisions that aren't very good for the business longer term, but they're pretty good for make the month.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
over time, you pay a price for that. And I think when you look through the different businesses of GE, certainly in the power business, they made a lot of decisions near the end on make the month
Mm.
that will hurt them for the next 10 years.
Yeah.
And,
Mm.
you can't just point to that one thing, I don't think, but
Yeah.
certainly, in my mind, a big factor of why GE went from, the sterling example of how to run a company to
Mm.
where they had to break the whole thing up.
Yeah. And now, of course, the last 5 years, GE brought in Larry Culp, formerly CEO of Danaher, to work on the lean transformation at GE, as we've been able to discuss a little bit with some GE people here on the podcast. But Art, really want to thank you for talking today. Hopefully, I asked you questions that you didn't address in the Lean Turnaround Answer book. Might be fun to not answer the same questions over and over.
Well, I think a lot of those things are covered in the answer book because,
Okay.
as I said at the beginning, um, you know, I think the articles in the Lean Turnaround Answer book pretty much cover every question that someone could have about Lean. Organizational structure, Lean fundamentals, management changes, management structure, all of those kind of things are covered. And so a lot of the examples I gave you today,
Okay.
probably going to find them in the Lean Answer book.
Well, you probably do get asked the same questions pretty frequently by different businesses. I'll encourage the readers to go check it out, the Lean Turnaround Answer book, and maybe if somebody does have a question that's not addressed in the book, maybe I can invite you back later this year, Art, if there's some fresh questions.
That'd be fine. I enjoy answering those kind of questions because that's really how people learn. That's how lean gets implemented in the first place, is you're learning something new. I always think of lean as nothing but a series of leaps of faith into
Mm,
the unknown, right?
yeah.
Because every time
Oh,
you change things, you move machines around and create a new cell, in the back of your mind, there's always the question of, well, what if this doesn't work?
well, but when we can rely on the experience of people like you who know what happens when you take the leap, that'll give people more confidence in a leap of a decision based on some proven past results. How's that? And some principles that we know
That's
apply.
that's correct. That's correct.
Well, I hope people will again check out Art's latest book, The Lean Turnaround Answer Book. The Lean Turnaround is still read very widely. My wife's CEO gave her that book 2 years ago to read. We listened to it together on a long relocation trip on audiobook. So The Lean Turnaround is still out there and highly recommended as well. So, Art, thank you again for being back here on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Okay, Mark, great to see you again, and thank you for having me.
Okay.